So welcome to our March version of Interventions into Disability Politics. I'm really excited to welcome Kirstie Stage to this evening's talk. Kirstie is a second-year PhD student researching disabled people and work in Britain between 1970 and 2010 at Christ's College, University of Cambridge, and for the British Library. She is also one of the co-founders of the UK Disability History and Heritage Hub. Previously, Kirstie received Wellcome Trust funding for her MA in the History of Medicine at the University of Warwick, where she researched deaf-led pressure groups. And before this, she researched the history of disability activism at Queen Mary University of London. Outside of academia, she's worked closely with non-governmental organisations, deaf and disabled people's organisations, and the United Nations to investigate the intersection between gender and disability. Quite a profile. And this evening, Kirstie is going to be presenting what she describes as a work in progress, probably humble, bridging the gap between trade unionism and the disabled people's movement.
Thank you so much.
When you're ready to start, yeah.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me okay? Just to say, I can't see the chat box, so brilliant.
Yes.
Your camera's on if there's something that comes up or you can't hear me or anything like that. Hello, everybody. Before I begin, I want to thank Zoe and Luke for the opportunity to speak today. My name's Kirstie, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a second-year PhD student. I'm a white woman with just below the shoulder brown hair. I'm wearing a lilac cardigan and I've got some silver earrings and a pair of glasses on. I also happen to be a deaf and disabled researcher. For accessibility reasons, I have tried to include proper nouns on the slides, mostly names, and have to apologise because some of the initial slides are a little overcrowded for this reason. Please do wave or let me know if you didn't hear something.
Thanks, Amy.
Whatever you do, feel
There are several.
Grady has joined the meeting alert.
I'm not sure if somebody's unmuted. I'm just going. I've sent the slides to Zoe and Luke earlier today, and I'm really happy to share the slides and the transcript for accessibility purposes. Please do feel free to get in touch with me or Zoe or Luke if you would like a copy. And the title of the paper today is called Bridging the Gap Between Trade Unionism and the Disabled People's Movement. And this title was actually inspired by one of TUDA's objectives that I'll talk a little bit about later, which was explicitly to bridge the gap. So these are not my words, they're directly from the sources. So before I want to start the talk, I thought it might be helpful to give a little introduction and to set some context to this research. Previously, as Zoe's mentioned, I've worked on the disability arts movement, specifically the block telethon protests of 1990 and 1992, as well as deaf-led activism through organisations such as the National Union of the Deaf, otherwise known as the NUD. In a moment, I will briefly discuss the NUD to demonstrate that deaf and disabled people have long been a part of the broader labour movement in Britain. Whilst this talk will not focus on the NUD for most of the paper, I'm happy to take questions on this too at the end. Just please bear with me and be patient if I don't understand or didn't quite hear your question the first time around. So today I'll present some of my doctoral work. My PhD is titled The Labour and Livelihoods of Disabled People in Britain from 1970 to 2010. And this paper is specifically focused on the third part of my chapter, a third chapter of mine, centred around the role of deaf and disabled trade unionists. At the moment, this is in very rough form as I'm still conducting archival research and hoping to do oral history interviews too. So it's very much a crude overview and a deep dive into some of TUDA's work. Given the time constraints, this is very brief, and there are several areas of research that I'm unable to cover today, but some of these might come up later in discussions in the Q&A. So I've broken this paper into 3 sections. The first, a contextual overview to show some examples of deaf and disabled people's organising that has been inspired by the tradition of trade unionism. The second, a brief summary of TUDA and some of its work. Then for the third part, thinking about how TUDA might help us to understand deaf and disabled people's experiences within the British labour movement. Of course, and it goes without saying, I welcome any thoughts, comments, or feedback. Drawing on archival materials from the Disabled People's Archive and the TUDA records online, I will use the Trade Union Disability Alliance, otherwise known as TUDA, as an example to explore disabled people's viewpoints and experiences across a range of trade unions. And I'm also hoping to do oral history interviews and have been heavily inspired by life memoirs and life writing. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of Bob Williams-Findlay's work, which is really great. I'd recommend it. And below there is a cartoon illustration of an oral history interview. At present, going back to TUDA, there are several gaps in archival records which pertain to important information, especially in the contextual history of the organisation, as TUDA doesn't have a potted history. This paper is clearly not arguing that the late 1970s and early 80s and 1990s happened in a vacuum. Whilst the social and political contexts were distinct from previous decades, for example, the privatisation of state-owned industries, the curtailing of power and influence of trade unions through various means, including legislation, as well as stark unemployment rates, deaf and disabled trade unionists are not new to this period. 1868 saw the creation of the Trades Union Congress, the National Centre for Trades Unions in Britain, and in the 1870s and 1880s saw the organisation of specific industries, such as farm workers, railwaymen, labourers and dockers. For this paper, I take inspiration from the work of Jack Saunders, Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite and Natalie Tomlinson, and refer to unionisation as the process in which individuals, often employees, come together to act collectively, usually through membership of specific trade unions or participating in collective political action. Deaf and disabled people's organising have long been part of the labour movement in Britain. Jill Crawshaw's work, for example, described deaf and disabled mill workers in the north of England during the 19th century and argued that they were a core part of the textiles workforce. Further, Crawshaw's research demonstrates the ways in which disabled people's roles in the workplace have been interwoven with the exploitation of industrial capitalism, she argues. Despite this, using testimonies from the archives, Crawshaw argues that, quote, disabled workers were resilient, had agency, and were integral to the workforce and the emerging trade union movement, end quote. Up until the 1970s, deaf and disabled people's organising tended to be framed around impairment-specific organising. However, TUDA was different to this, as it was a pan-impairment group, bringing together deaf and disabled people with the aims of developing a collective interest in improving workers' rights, conditions, and possibilities for employment. Before discussing TUDA in greater depth, I want to set out 2 examples of organisations that were inspired by trade unionism and discuss the extent to which they were successful in obtaining trades union affiliations. However, the 2 examples that I will speak about might be considered single impairment groups. However, I refer to impairment here with slight caution in relation to the National Union of the Deaf, who made very strong arguments in the 1980s using rhetoric from the United Nations, and they argued that deaf people were and still are, a cultural and linguistic minority in the United Kingdom. Here I want to acknowledge the cultural framing of deafness, or big D deaf, which is preferred amongst many within the British deaf community. So here there are some complex interactions and perceptions interwoven here that sometimes create ideological separations. This makes TUDA an even more interesting and thought-provoking example, in the sense that whilst there were many discussions, for example, about the social model of disability, there were also opportunities and there was sharing of information across disabled people, deaf people, people who today might self-identify as neurodivergent, or a mixture of all three. For example, TUDA News, which was the newsletter that was published on a regular basis, had advertisements of support for the 1990s British Sign Language marches in London, which was an important series of events within British deaf history, alongside memos about the emerging self-advocacy movement in the 1990s, as well as various flyers and posters related to the disability arts movement. Here, the pan-impairment focus and strategy set TUDA apart from other organisations inspired by the tradition of trade unionism. So before I go on to this, I just want to explain what I've got on the slides. So there are 3 images at the top, and then there is a block text underneath. In the far left is an image from the National Archives showing the rules of the National League of the Blind from 1899. In the middle, we have an image from the Working Class Movement Library, and it shows mostly men wearing caps and suits, some with mobility aids. At the front, there is a Justice Not Charity banner from one of the marches, and on the far right side we've also got another source from the National Archives, which shows the application for registry of trade union from 1889, and these are all linked to the National League of the Blind, which was founded in 1893. And underneath the sources there is a quote which actually comes from the Birmingham Daily Gazette in 1920, so later on, and it's of the Blind Men's March. So it says, with haversacks, water bottles, and other impemenda on their backs, they trampled along 4 abreast, bearing banners appealing for direct government support and no charity, to the tunes of marching songs, the playing of bugles, and the shrill notes of the pipes of the various bands of ex-servicemen who accompanied them." End quote. So the first impairment-specific trade union that I'd like to briefly consider is the National League of the Blind, which later became the National League of the Blind and Disabled in 1968. This discussion is heavily inspired by the existing work of Matthias Rees and Dawn Kasma. Rees has written the detailed history of the League up until 1970, and Dawn has conducted doctoral research on the blind marches of the 1920s and 1930s, including the well-known Jarrow March of 1936. In the late 19th century, the League was established as a trade union with the aims of recognising the capabilities of blind people. At this point, there were changes happening in Britain with a comprehensive, sorry, I just noticed. Okay, I'll look at that question later, thank you. And we'll get on to the TUDA content in a minute. At this point, there were changes happening in Britain with a comprehensive Braille system launched in 1902. Though Braille had been introduced earlier in 1861, as well as compulsory education and training, suggested by the 1889 Royal Commission on the Blind and Deaf and later mandated by the 1893 Act. This challenged pervasive stereotypical tropes and assumptions that blind people were incapable of, quote, of proper work, unquote, and were a burden upon local authorities. Further, the League deployed the slogan, "Justice, not charity," suggesting that they did not want charity, but fair employment conditions and recognition of blind people in society. The union itself was organised by blind people. For example, the League's first General Secretary was Ben Peirce, a piano tuner who had previously trained at Henshaw's Blind Asylum and became blind in his early years. From the beginning, the League was established to represent blind workers who were being exploited in private industry and in the charity sector. The National League of the Blind was registered as a trade union in 1899. It received TUC affiliation in 1902 and was affiliated to the Labour Party in 1909. Sometimes the leadership of the League affected the political approaches that it took. For example, under Peirce's leadership, the League took a more conciliatory approach, sometimes working with charities, but also campaigned for the state to take responsibility for blind people's employment and offering a viable pension if a blind person could not work. The League's political activity also comprised of strikes, with its first action taking place in 1912 in Bristol, and it lasted 6 months, as well as putting pressure on government by organising marches across Britain, for example, in Newport, Leeds and Manchester. Much of the League's comprehensive political lobbying work resulted in legislative changes, notably the 1920 Blind Persons Act, which reduced the pension age for blind people from 70 to 50. And it also required local authorities to promote blind people's welfare. Whilst it is true that World War I and the number of blinded ex-service people contributed to these campaigning efforts, the League's work put pressure on government, not only by marches, but also by lobbying for private members' bills to raise the demands of blind workers, which was later taken up by Labour MP Ben Tillett, though the government of the day refused support and later sought to introduce an alternative. In more recent years, the union has moved away from many formal organisations and charities, with a preference to not register as a charity, but instead to remain loyal to, quote, identification with the values and principles of the trade union movement, end quote. In 2000, further changes took place as the League amalgamated with the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation, which is now part of a trade union called Community. Here, the history of the League shows that blind people have long been a part of the British labour movement. Often there's a tendency to claim that certain histories is new. And I strongly argue that disabled trade unionists have always been a part of and contributed to trade unionism, even if this is not always reflected as thoroughly as possible in current research or reflected at all. In the case of the League, here is an example of disabled-led organising within the tradition of the labour movement. And this is a specific example centred around the demands of blind people. Whilst the League was impairment-specific, in other words, focusing on the demands and experiences of blind workers, their work was also outlined by other organisations inspired by the trade union tradition. I will now move on to the National Union of the Deaf, the NUD, to set out another example of deaf-led campaigns centred around various issues, from deaf children's education, television representation in British Sign Language, and access to cultural arenas, for example, captioning, as well as access to technology such as teletypewriters and minicoms, and employment discrimination, as well as opportunities. The NUD, which was founded in 1976, challenged paternalistic approaches from long-standing deaf charities such as the British Deaf Association and the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. Archived letters and correspondence suggest that the NUD were more of a deaf-led fringe group in relation to the mainstream British deaf community. Through regular newsletters and social events, the NUD fostered a grassroots structure to bring deaf people together from all parts of the United Kingdom. In April 1978, for example, the NUD had 329 members, 64 associate members from hearing people, and 3 subscribers. The demographics of NUD support was broad in most regions of England and extended further to Canada and the United States of America. Whilst the NUD never formally disbanded, the group have been less active since around 2005. I wanted to begin thinking about why trade unions and the labour movement mattered to the NUD. After all, the deaf-led group deployed a strong rhetoric of, quote, unions and unity, end quote. Part of this probably was because of the NUD's leftist politics, with the NUD co-founder, Paddy Ladd, writing about the importance of brotherhood, grassroots socialism, and engagements with trade unions who demanded stronger rights for their membership. The NUD's membership largely centred around male workers, although trade union demographics in this period reflected an increasing number of women and people of colour, for example, becoming members alongside disabled trade unions, disabled trade unionists who were also beginning to organise independently. Interestingly, the NUD drew direct inspiration from the National League of the Blind and Disabled and used their case as an example of working with the British labour movement to improve the conditions of deaf people in Britain. Despite their ambitions to seek connections with official trade union bodies, the NUD were fairly unsuccessful in their pursuits. Unlike the League, the NUD applied for TUC affiliation in 1976, but were declined on 2 accounts. First, that their objectives did not fit with the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act of 1974. And second, because the TUC did not perceive them as a trade union, but instead as a pressure group trying to urge other agencies, such as the government and other deaf institutions, to take more notice of the needs of deaf people. And that was a direct quote from the sources at the Modern Record Centre. However, a unique part of this discussion and a unique factor of this interaction is that it provides an alternative reason, something that wasn't clear, something that was evident in the archives at the MRC was that this interaction gives further insight and reasoning for this refusal. So the private internal correspondence between Ken Graham and Peter Jacques, who were active in the TUC executive at the time, implied that the rejection was actually indicative of a political decision, as they had little desire to partner with the NUD, but had to offer a meeting in order to, in their words, maintain a good public image and good public relations. Herein lies a really interesting example of the TUC demonstrating definitions of what it means by trade union, how interpretations were seemingly interrelated to and complied with broader legislation, as well as conceptions of pressure groups, even if this discourse around pressure groups appeared to be dismissive of the NUD's work and its association with the labour movement. Indeed, whilst the rejected affiliation contributed to the NUD's claims to marginalisation, the NUD continued to work with local trade union members to raise issues with the larger TUC infrastructure. In the 1980s and 1990s, archival traces infer that there was opposition within the British labour movement to what was perceived as single issues. And this language was often used as a mechanism to block support for specific groups or campaigns, thus refusing TUC affiliations for organisations such as the NUD. During the mid-1990s, TUDA set out as a voluntary campaigning group open to all disabled people who are trade union members. In September 2010, TUDA also noted the number of unemployed disabled people or disabled job seekers and hoped to broaden their appeal to recruit members who were not affiliated with any specific trade unions. TUDA focused primarily on being an organisation for and by disabled people who were interested in employment issues, with a specific aim to influencing and put pressure on the TUC. Whilst TUDA had a grassroots structure driven by its primary membership of disabled trade unionists, major decisions were made by the TUDA Executive Committee. The Executive Committee were elected at the AGM, and the democratic structure of the organisation remained a strong point of the group, as seen by the number of surveys and consultations published in TUDA News, their newsletter that I mentioned earlier. As TUDA members shared information about their rights, concerns about trade unions, knowledge of tribunal systems, and issues facing disabled workers, disabled trade unionists demanded visibility and equal treatment to non-disabled colleagues. From the late 1990s, TUDA was perhaps representative of a shift away from male-dominated traditional industrial labour groups based principally on fraternity and solidarity towards a space for workers that was attempting to delve into issues that had been underrepresented within the trade union movement, such as the recognition of gender, race, ethnicity and sexual orientation. As part of this shift, TUDA claimed that disability fell under an equality issue that needed to be addressed in a trade union setting. TUDA addressed several issues from disabled people's perspectives and lived experiences. Because of TUDA's grassroots structure, the hard work and commitment of members made newsletters, stalls at in-person events, and the overall running of the organisation possible. Funding mainly came from within the community of disabled trade unionists and affiliated groups, including trade unions, rather than from external financial sources such as centralised government funding. Building on the information in the previous slide, TUDA sought to reframe disability as an equalities issue rather than an issue related to quotas or moral obligation, which often drew upon patronising charity depictions. In addition, TUDA as a network for and by disabled people set it apart from most disability charities and professional organisations at the time. And this is something that I will touch upon later. On screen is TUDA's mission statement that was used in the mid-1990s, which was often found in its publications, TUDA News. The central focus was to coordinate the voice of disabled people in the trade union movement. Here are the three main objectives that TUDA sought to work towards in the 1990s. So the first is to bridge the gap between the trade union and disability movements. The second, to work within and lobby trade unions to ensure they make their own services and meetings accessible to disabled members, and that they support our continuing campaign for full civil rights. And the third, to promote understanding of disability as an equalities issue, giving talks and training to trade unions. On the screen, we can see some examples of trade union representation among TUDA members. This was published in the TUDA newsletter in December 2000. For example, on screen, there are a range of unions representing teachers, physiotherapists, communication workers, youth workers, actors, civil servants, boilermakers, amongst many other examples. As a continuation of the previous slide and the membership list, here are some more unions that were affiliated in 2000. So we've got unions representing schoolmasters and journalists, higher education professionals, students, footballers, radiographers, transport workers, bankers, and shop workers, to list a few. And interestingly, we can see the former National League of the Blind and Disabled on the list too. TUDA very much offered an alternative route to charity provision and state initiatives within the 1990s, often operating in a backdrop of paternalism and dominated by non-disabled people. For example, in the field of employment and disability, active discussions took place around the influence of non-disabled professionals in TUDA news, and these were also published elsewhere in other spaces, for example, Coalition, which is the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People's magazine. Lorraine Gradwell of Breakthrough UK, for example, wrote that she had intended to include a list of traditional organisations who, quote, usually work in the field of disabled people in employment. Unfortunately, we ran out of space, end quote. After listing a number of organisations, including Remploy, Scope, Pathways, and Rathbones, TUDA News reiterated a comment from Lorraine's piece suggesting, quote, if all of these organisations were staffed entirely by disabled people, the employment problem for disabled people would be solved instantly, end quote. From this perspective, entry into the labour market for disabled people became a key principle, and TUDA members often openly highlighted their concerns around the role of disability charities in this debate. Some TUDA articles highlighted what was called the double invisibility of members, showing reports from 2003 about the challenges facing Black and Asian disabled people. For example, some comments suggested that Black and Asian disabled people felt, quote, excluded by local authorities and charities because they are predominantly run by white and middle-class people, end quote, as well as, quote, their own communities which don't cater for their disabled members, end quote. TUDA also gave light to older disabled workers, people who fell out of the average working age, who experienced discrimination in the context of shortlisting and the failing to interview disabled candidates. In contrast to most charities and philanthropic bodies, TUDA was a disabled-led group that was independent from official bodies and very much depended upon its membership for support. This in itself posed further challenges, for example, fundraising and financial support and limited resources through precarious times. Again, perhaps there's a parallel here to be drawn with the bleak and precarious funding landscape of deaf and disabled people's organisations today, and the burnout of overworked deaf and disabled activists who are often unpaid or considerably underpaid for their labour. Going back to TUDA, up until 2013, all individual TUDA members belonged to trade unions. TUDA also had local and national connections to trade unions and the TUC bodies, with the archives showing comprehensive lists of members and affiliations. For example, one 2005 TUDA circular spoke about the group's influence. Direct quote here, 17 TUC affiliates, including the Big Four, Amicus, Unison, T&G and GMB, are affiliated to TUDA on a national basis. Many other union branches, regions and individual members are members of TUDA, end quote. In 2005, the TUDA newsletter claimed, quote, we have many members who hold influential positions in the labour and trade union movement and in the disability movement. While we cannot claim to have the power to change the world of disabled people, we are confident that we punch above our weight, end quote. It was not until 2000 that the TUC acted on the demands of TUDA and other disabled trade unionists who demanded a change in its position on disability equality. Following lobbying attempts, the TUC decided to create 3 new seats in the General Council. And these were designated for a lesbian or gay member, a disabled member, and a young person aged under 27. I've got here Dave Cook, a TUDA person, responded to this announcement, quoting, This is extremely good news for disabled trade unionists. We must now organise ourselves to take advantage ourselves of this opportunity. As an umbrella organisation to challenge political parties, disability organisations, and to a certain extent the TUC, TUDA was not afraid of commenting on emerging structures and initiatives that affected disabled people. For example, in 2002, TUDA reported on the recently formed TUC Disability Committee, following a meeting on the 8th of February, which was chaired by Mark Fish. Despite its links to various trade unions, TUDA kept distance from official institutional structures to allow for a degree of scrutiny and non-partisan collaborative work. TUDA members gathered feedback on the TUC Disability Committee by attendance at various disabled people's events. Most of the feedback linked to the TUC Disability Committee was centred around a lack of accessibility, which was often specific to the TUC headquarters or Congress House. In addition, the critique of restricted access extended beyond physical access, noting other areas including poor access for those of us with sensory or intellectual impairments. From the archives, there is a clear sense that deaf and disabled trade unionists' concerns about the lack of access and challenges of getting to London, for example, with public formal trade union bodies. However, this was one area that TUDA took an active role in challenging. For example, TUDA News reported on the lively debate at the first TUC Disability Committee meeting, with several TUDA members determined to put across their views. One proposition was for the 2003 to 2004 TUC Disability Committee meeting to be hosted outside of London. The repetition of access as a problem reiterated the ways in which the built environment was not suitable for everyone and gave insight into how physical barriers prevented disabled trade unionists from having the chance to participate fully. TUDA members sought to bridge the gap between the disabled people's movement and trade unionism by debating and monitoring national policies relating to disabled people's employment, as well as drawing on issues that affected disabled people, including cuts to social care, welfare support, and austerity later on. For instance, in 2004, TUDA gave an update on the New Deal for disabled people, making a comparison with the previous job broker scheme 3 years prior. In this monitoring notice, TUDA recognised the limitations of statistics and interpreting policy outcomes. For example, TUDA News mentions, quote, "Although the figures are encouraging that disabled people are getting back into work, the overhanging issue still remains. What sort of jobs are being obtained and where?" End quote. TUDA illustrated the scarcity of information, highlighting in December 2003, there were 52,120 participants in the programme and 33,640 disabled people registered with the job broker in 2003. In the same period, 17,860 jobs were gained by participants in the programme. Of these, 12,860 obtained the jobs through brokers, and the rest through the New Deal for Disabled People Job Centre Plus Jobs. TUDA offered an opening for the disabled people's movement and the British Labour movement to share issues, to strategise, and to build on tactics to improve disabled people's working conditions. For example, in January 2004, TUDA News proclaimed the title "Disability Conference Success," well, at least about the motion to Congress. In this publication, TUDA wrote about their motion calling for a European directive to improve disabled people's rights across goods and services, that members argued would have had an enormous effect on all disabled people in and out of work. It's clear that strategy was central to TUDA's campaigning work, especially understanding the stakeholders and organisations involved in large-scale political projects affecting disabled people, including disabled trade unionists and disabled people's organisations. For example, in 2004, TUDA claimed, "This European Year of Disabled People has not been marked by any political initiatives by the European Union. The European Disability Forum is for such a directive. If the UK government came out in support of a directive, this could be pivotal in persuading the EU to pass a directive. From this example of TUDA's work, it's evident that TUDA recognised the value of lobbying the UK government to influence transnational bodies and to contribute to European political action. Further, TUDA also sought to build a critical mass of support across the disabled people's movement and trade unionism. TUDA's membership was broad and expansive amongst the disabled people's movement and the disability arts movement, as well as the British deaf community. Throughout TUDA publications, there are advertisements for various women's projects, including conferences on the Black Women's Mental Health Project and the UK Women's Committee, founded in 1999. There are specific references to disabled women's involvement with trade unions. In 2001, the editor in TUDA News responded to a letter by TUDA member Liz Fetz, saying, quote, "We'd be interested in other women's experiences too. We know, for example, that many disabled women have had disempowering experiences in the structures of their trade union," end quote. Kirsten Herder Regard LGBT+ liaison also discussed belonging to multiple communities and facing various forms of oppression, and the need for solidarity and uniting as one to challenge issues that are hard to tackle, including within the labour movement. Similarly, TUDA member Roderick Cobley from London Autistic Rights Movement, ARM, wrote about the early stages of forming relationships with the trade union movement, partly through TUDA. Cobley continued by inviting TUDA members to reach out to him personally if they were autistic or sympathetic with them to get involved. Through various means and channels, TUDA reached out to numerous audiences involved in separate from the British Labour movement and the disabled people's movement. Here, TUDA membership had access to more expansive information and opportunities, as well as found space for local, national and international work, campaigning and organising work. Like all social movements and communities, there are indeed clashes in approaches and difficulties amongst the TUDA membership and executive. This was not always evident in the TUDA newsletters themselves, but through anecdotal stories and personal conversations. There were certainly challenges and limitations to TUDA's work. Sometimes the archives pointed to specific individuals who took their employees to court for cases of discrimination after the passing of the 1995 Disability Discrimination Act. And these cases were sometimes trade unions themselves, disabled people taking trade unions to court for discrimination. Sadly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, various forms of ableism within and amongst trade unions remained prevalent, even after TUDA's formation. Another factor to consider was the built environment and access to spaces. For example, the physical barriers in Congress House or the attitudinal barriers which prevented some people with intellectual impairments from participating fully in events organised by trade unions. As a voluntary group, TUDA also had to manage its membership with limited resources, juggling personal demands and trade unionists with varying ideas about ideological persuasions or political approaches. Overall, TUDA generated a space for deaf and disabled trade unionists to organise, debate national polities, share issues and strategies, build on tactics, highlight upcoming opportunities, and build a critical mass of supports. Trade unionism was therefore a mechanism for sharing knowledge and information amongst deaf and disabled people, as well as non-disabled allies. On screen, I have a stakeholder listing of what was called professional and disability contacts from the Association of Disabled Professionals, and this was in their archive, which is housed at the British Library. And it highlights TUDA and three of its members, Andrew Bruce, Murray Glickman and Marion Reichart, And the archival traces show that TUDA was cited as a main reference point for disabled people and trade unions amongst charities, unions, and broader activist circles. Yet, deaf and disabled people's organising was impeded by forces of ableism within trade unions, as well as the differing priorities and strategies amongst the broader British Labour movement. Despite this, TUDA was important not only in establishing a collective space and voice, but for pushing for internal changes amongst trade union bodies. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry for the hiccups a couple of times throughout. I look forward to your questions, comments and feedback, and I'm really looking forward to reading the comment in the chat box, which I wasn't able to read earlier. Thank you.